Well, my name is Tim Carter, of course, and this is the Apologetic and Outreach Ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church. And this is a final word, certainly not exhaustive. I'm working on collecting the disparities between two positions or from points of view from which a contradiction seems to persist. And I'm trying to answer the question, why is it that so many people are unable, myself included, to easily see from a point of view from which a contradiction disappears. And in the old and young earth discussion, I posted several things about it from the language, but did not discuss some of the things when you evaluate old and young earth in light of the original text. And I think it'll be easier just to just write this out and go over it, and let's look and see what young and old earth creation have in common, and then see some of the differences. So first of all, we're just going to look at the first two verses, and this is just, you can print this off Blue Letter Bible, and then I use it because of the large font size, and it makes it a lot easier for me. So just quickly, this is a preposition in our language, and of course this is an Eastern Oriental language. This book, Genesis for example, was written, let's say, around 1500 years before Christ, and now we've had 2,000 years since Christ. So we're looking at a 3,500 year old document that is record Eastern Oriental, and we're Western Occidental. And as you'll learn from better men than I'll ever be, when you attend seminary, they'll tell you that the conflict lies in the differences in culture often. So this language reads from right to left, up, down. Yes, that's interesting. But I'll just break it down. This is in, of course, and we'll just translate it in the direction it actually occurs. Now, this word is head. In head, like the head of a river. That's nothing complicated. So in head. In bara, this word means to fashion or form something. So we'll just put form. It can mean to fill something that's empty. In certain inflected forms of the Hebrew, it could mean to fatten. In other places it refers to fatten. So we'll just leave it form for the moment. So in head, and we'll put formed. It's a Cal imperfect, third masculine, singular. Of course, here's the word Elohim. It's a very popular word. It's in a plural, but often translated God singular. Strong ones or powers is how you'd learn it can be expressed in the Hebrew. And this is just a sign of the direct object when the object has a definite article, and there's the definite article. So this is the heaven. It's plural. It's translated in the English King James as singular, similar to God is translated singular. So heaven, or heavens plural, if you wanted to. And then this is the word the earth, definite article. So in head, God formed the heaven, and that's the word and the earth. So there we are. That's it. Now, before we proceed, just something that we can observe in both old, if you don't mind me say old earth creation, and I can find some similarities, young earth creation. One thing we now can see is that they both assume that bara, they both assume old and young, which is ironic when you notice this. This is one of the things that's missing. It's a fallible element for both of them. It's a fallible element. They both use it, they both treat it as though it's Hayah, which is ironic because you'll hear a lot of people in young earth camp will say that Hayah is was and not come to be, except they treat bara as come to be, meaning they take bara as come to exist, come to be, or exist, which is a very remote meaning of bara. Actually, that's a stretch. If a person is not careful, you really would have a more difficult time asserting that. It's just that because of culture and tradition and so many years, people insist that that create there is a come to be. You can read in John's Gospel, the first chapter, the word create doesn't appear anywhere, and yet it tells us that without Jesus, nothing came to be that ever became. So both of them, strikingly, this is the number one fallible element, both assume and treat bara as come to be, come to exist. And of course that's something they agree on. Now, young earth creationists don't have people that can think critically enough to point that out. They just move on like we all assume that we know what we're talking about when we say in beginning God created. But that's not the case if you compare it to the creation attributes that attribute to Christ his role in creation. Well, the next sentence, we'll get there. It says, and, of course, here's the word and. So, and the earth. Running out of room because I don't know how to write that direction. Here's the infamous Cal Perfect, third feminine singular, earth came to be or came to exist, or perhaps someone could say had come to exist, meaning it had previously done that. So you can be true to the come to be. The earth had come to exist, and then here's tohu vivahu, which is where you could say formless and empty or void. So what we have here is from the Oriental language. It just starts with fashioning. It doesn't answer the question when the earth came to be, came to exist. But again, remember, both young and old earth creationists assume bara, and most ironic is Dr. Ken Ham, the theme park director of Answers in Genesis, says ha-yah is was, but he didn't say in beginning, in head, God. Well, he uses bara for come to be. There's no way to translate it otherwise. He means God caused the heavens and the earth to come to be. But now that would be a hifil stem, which doesn't appear. A hifil stem, and it would be it would have to inflect the verb ha-yah. And that doesn't exist. That's not there. That doesn't exist. Again, it's not a conflict. It's just that form. So really, the Western mind reads this as in beginning God caused the heavens and the earth to come to exist. Now that's a lot. Actually, it's more imported. We call it eisegesis, but it's more difficult than that. This comes from CQ. You've heard of IQ. We all have. We've heard of EQ. This is emotional intelligence, and this is IQ, the intelligent quotient. There's cultural intelligence, the cultural quotient. And one thing Dr. Penn, Dr. Owen, and the language teachers, even especially Dr. Mark Thornton, he can tell you that the difference between an Eastern Oriental language, you have to start thinking this way. Well, how do you get us to want to think that way? As I would tell you from a Cherokee background, the West will win, and that's just the way it is. But Dr. Penn would tell you you need a wisdom quotient, which involves how do you properly process and interpret. So using Dr. Penn, for example, he would be a Western Occidental interpreter, but different than the young earth creationism, which is all Western Occidental interpretation, which does not invite the Eastern Oriental language into it. So with a Western Occidental interpreter who invites this language, he doesn't have a problem with this being come to be, and actually demonstrates it from the Koine text from the word genomai. And you can ask anybody, use blueletterbible.org, you can look that up, and you can actually see verses in the Bible, the Old Testament, that contain ha-yathah, and then you can go to the New Testament and look up verses that, and genomai in the Koine text is always come to be. So young earthers don't have a problem with bara being come to exist, but when they come here, they don't want this to be come to exist, because somehow that is untenable for them and their argument. And we're all like that. We all avoid, it's called source avoidance, source bias. It's called cognitive and affective bias, where what we think we prefer. And that's back to how much weight do you give the Eastern culture? How much are you willing to engage in a cogent conversation, and how much are you developed emotionally, and we call it spiritual character, to have even this conversation. Because what I've observed and what I'm working on in my dissertation, it's in biblical psychology, counseling particularly in psychology, but both have something in common here that is really more in common than I think they would like to admit. But here, it's so the earth here comes to be formless and empty. Well, from the Eastern view, that just gives a rationale for why it need to be formed, you see. Of course, though, that takes when it came to exist completely off the page. That is, that's a discussion that doesn't find itself within the Genesis 1:1 to the end of the book of Revelation. It's now before the Bible itself. In this Eastern language, they just begin with the account of forming and fashioning that which was without form. And to say was is to say somehow it did not come to be, that is, as a happening. It was just the state and condition in which it was at the time God began to form it. So young and old earth, there's no interval here. If you're an old earth creationist and you say this is create or come to exist, then they move the earth into, they move the event of when it came to exist into the Bible. And they say that the condition changed, came to be formless and empty, and that it wasn't originally that way. Now that is based on a theology from Genesis 1:1 to the end of the book. A young earth creationist will say that it came to exist here, and this was the condition that it came, or that it was always in. And I don't really know any more how to explain it. Just they have no interval, like Edersheim wrote years and years ago, that one day there would be knowledge man would have, looking forward to the future, of what time interval there was, because he said at the time, just using the biblical Hebrew, that was not known. Well, it goes on and says, in darkness was, you have to supply was, a be verb, because there is no was in Hebrew, which that kind of makes the argument of another fallible element, was or become. There's no such word in Hebrew for was. This is ha-yah. And so in concept, young earth creationists, or advocates I suppose, they don't mind bara functioning as a come to exist. And you say, well, that's inconsistent. Well, it's irrelevant. That's our Western culture. Today, when people defend a Genesis creation account, it's English. It's a Western English mindset, and that's becoming more prevalent. For example, how few people actually study biblical Hebrew? I mean, who's your audience? Do you really want to go out and say, well, I want to convert the Western world to the Eastern mind? That's not even a purpose in the Great Commission. So it says, in darkness was upon faces of, and here's just deep, And then here's and Ruach, spirit of Elohim, spirit of God, power, strong ones, was intently, this is a PL participle, intently hovering upon faces of the waters. So here's the waters. And basically all I was doing was, I've been marveling at how much people have been struggling, but both old and young earth bring the time that the earth came to exist into the Genesis account. The biblical Hebrew, however, doesn't do that. It just simply starts with the fashioning process. So an old earther, for lack of a better word, it's just for the pragmatic conversation, will say that it came to exist here and that what happened to it is here. So they have exist or created, meaning it was brought into existence. So it was created here, and then this is what happened here. What young earth creation finds untenable is that if you have this interval, then it opens the door for time. And young earth creation, to be a true young earth creation, the key word is young. So both agree on earth, both agree on Genesis 1:1, both take a little bit of liberties with the language and say ha-yah. It's just the banter still between young and old. But if you actually went all the way back to Eastern Oriental, the Eastern Oriental language, you would find that it's not even inside the narrative when it actually came to be, that presupposed. So you'd have to go outside. And then that's why both sides begin to quote science, because they're saying there is no discussion in the Bible on how to date the earth. When the Bible was dated by Ussher, he was pinning, literally correlating the events of the Bible to actual historical events. So that if you're a young earther, you'll say in the year 4000, I don't know exactly, and maybe if I can remember, October 23rd, the year 4004 BC. And that's all wonderful. It just doesn't exist in the Oriental 3,500-year-old biblical account. That is, Moses didn't start with, in the beginning God caused the heaven and the earth to come to exist. Then the earth came to be changed into something formless or empty. No, it starts off with he formed it, and here's the rationale: it was without form, it was formless. And old earthers are more true to this word as it appears in the language, because it is determined to become to be when you go and correlate it with how Holy Spirit translated it in the Greek New Testament. There's a strong case for that. And both have the equal value. So let's just make some conclusions. And I'll have to use a blank card here. So here's some conclusions that we can make, and it can kind of show you why we have a conflict. There's a cultural quotient, which, let's say if you rank low in that, that is if you devalue the Eastern Oriental culture, then of course the kind of language and the thought there, you won't really add that. Now old earth creation, highly valued, so they get a higher rating on cultural quotient. Both young earth and old earth creationists both take some liberties with Bara. They both need that to be the time the earth came to exist, which when you study that out, even in an English text, you might find yourself a little bit alarmed at how much you learn in the context that that's not really being discussed the way you think it is. And so cultural quotient, there's more value from old earth than old earth creationists. They invite Ha-Yatham. They invite it as it is, as it can be translated, or come to exist. Come to exist. And that can be translated had come to be or exist. Be or exist. had come to be and exist, and they see that as a transition from its original condition that they both affirm, both young and old. So really the conflict, I don't know why there's a conflict. It seems to be, but there's so few people, like seminarians, how many are there out there that actually first went to seminary, secondly did well in seminary, thirdly continued to study after seminary? There's just not that many people. So subject matter expertise is, now you hear people quote their own sources of authority. Of course, that's in fallacious reasoning. It's just that if you want to go all the way back and just say, well, let's just take it from the original Eastern Oriental viewpoint, then it just starts talking about the fashioning, which for an old earther, that's not bad. They would take that and say, okay, so here's where the repair of the earth began in verse 1 to make it habitable for man because of this. Young earthers say, no, this is where it came to exist because the Western concept of create is the Bible's concept of come to be, which John's Gospel, the first chapter in English, even demonstrates that the Bible's notion of create, the way we think of it, is actually a come to being into existence, and that's proven. So really, this is why I add the Eastern Oriental knowledge to the portfolio of knowledge here at our church here at Landmark Jacksonville, because it's something they're so accustomed to. They're so accustomed from all the pastors that went before, who were seminarians, scholars. They cited Oriental language, Koine Greek, Hebrew language. Our church was actually the organizational service overseen by President of the Missionary Baptist Seminary, Dr. L.D. Foreman. He invited the Oriental language into the discussion. So, no, we have people here that will never prefer this type of thinking. It would certainly not be something for them to go to Genesis 1:1 and think that that's not where the earth was created or came into existence. That would be, you could spend the rest of your life just trying to appeal to people why I wouldn't know, to try to persuade them to this. But that would be an act in futility. Again, my name is Tree. My grandmother was born on a reservation in Kingfisher County, the city of Dover, Oklahoma. And the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, contrary to the Supreme Court ruling, which said we could remain in our lands and of all of our wealth and all of our, we would have had an infinite amount of wealth today with the holdings. Andrew Jackson said he didn't have to honor what the Supreme Court ruling said, and he took the money and destroyed the lives of many people. So in the West, we lose, and this Cherokee, who's been taught to think like a cowboy, think like the West, is not about to start telling people, go back to the East. That's not why I'm here. I'm here to make disciples. We teach the teachings of Jesus, and I just introduce. But this is what was missing, and I was asked by several people to go ahead and just say it. It's just that this is content from my dissertation for Louisiana Baptist University, and it wasn't to be out here just in open vulgar banter, I suppose, because I don't treat the level of this text. I see the low level of exegesis and the cultural lack of cultural intelligence, and especially appreciation for the conflict between cultures, East and West. There's just not a lot of appreciation right now. So yes, I accept that the Western creation account in the English, which is considered the Bible, no matter what you say the Hebrew says or what you say the Greek says, it's, as I said before, and I'll conclude here, but when I study Greek and Hebrew, people say, oh, you're studying Greek and Hebrew. But when they study the Bible, I can't say, oh, you're studying English. If they get a degree in theology, I don't say, oh, you have a degree in English. But if I get a degree in Bible languages, they say, oh, you have a degree in Bible languages. So I say, no, I just studied the Bible, but it was the one in the Oriental languages. Oh, well, that'll never be the case. It'll never be the case that someone sees me doing this and they say, oh, you're studying the Bible. No, they say, oh, what is that, Hebrew? So that's the reality of our culture. And even my own grandbaby came in when I had some of these pages on the desk, said, are you studying Spanish, Papa T? So she's already unaware that it might be possible that I was studying the Bible. but unless it looks like something she's enculturated by, it can't be. So no, if someone says they're a young earther, they really are saying, I'm an advocate for the English Bible, Western, Occidental expression of the creation account. If someone says they're an old earther, they're saying, I'm inviting the Eastern, Oriental languages and that creation account into the conversation. So really, young and old earth isn't really what's being discussed. It's actually a matter of the West version of creation versus the East. This was, of course, the original, oldest version, and that does make it untenable. And this is why there's a lot of friction, because you got to remember there's not very many people emotionally developed for the conversation. Even IQ doesn't seem to override the emotion. Looks like the affective side hijacks the intellect, if you will, when the amygdala kicks in and triggers the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, if you will, for a technical expression. The rational brain is hijacked and cultural quotient's out the door, and then the wisdom quotient doesn't really ever it's hard to sit down with a wise person to oversee all this. So that's enough for now, but Bara does not equal Haya, but both young and old earth creationists alike accept that this is when the earth came to exist, and where they disagree is here. But old earth is more of an Eastern Oriental view. Young earth is the Western view of creation. And yes, the West will win, and I don't know anyone that would be silly enough to not admit that. So you have a blessed